About the book specifically. So tell me about if you give me a little bit of kind of background, it'll be fantastic.
So I suppose in the simplest form, we started an agency in the hearing care industry, which is a bit of a niche in the US and Canada. So we now support kind of 55, 60 clinics and help them build better private clinics.
Wow.
But that industry is an interesting one because hearing care has got its own challenges with the stigma associated to it, meaning that most people that need to do something don't do anything.
That's going to be me in a few years' time because, I mean, most people, even if you aren't hearing impaired, strictly speaking, when you get older, you get cocktail party deafness. You can't separate background noise from other noises very well. I think you lose your high-range hearing, don't you, as you age?
That's it.
Which I definitely notice.
Yeah, and although we all commonly kind of have our eyes checked, our teeth checked, hearing's still a taboo that you only go and get your hearing checked if you've got a real problem.
Well, it's also a bit of a boiled frog problem because, of course, other people will notice it because you've turned the television up massively loud, but you may not notice it yourself for ages.
That's so common. That's what happens. It's all them day-to-day increments that nobody notices.
Yeah. Boiled frog.
Boiled frog is the perfect way. Yeah. So that's kind of our game. But we've been a long-term follower of yours, and I actually first heard about you probably about it must have been 7-8 years ago. And I came here. I got a meeting here. I used to run a direct mail company that did everything handwritten.
It wasn't called. Hold on. Tell me what it's called.
It was called Scribble Mail.
That's a different one. There's another one which we work with as well, which actually is quite good because it tends to employ people who are housebound or disabled. Yeah. I'm just trying to remember what on earth I was. It's not called Scribed, is it?
It's called Scribely or Scribe. There
are a few.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely brilliant business. And by the way, those businesses will have a bit of a resurgence because I think, the reason companies like Made have failed is, I hate to say this, but you need to produce a fucking catalogue and mail it out occasionally. Yeah. Okay? No, most people are not in market for furniture 98% of the time. And so, you're fundamentally, by being a pull business rather than a push business, not doing any conventional advertising, you're missing out. Yeah.
It's so true. I think we're into the podcast, Mike. We may as well flow, and we'll just cut on it. So let me set this up because what I found has been very interesting is applying a lot of lessons from external industries to our industry because it's very much locked in its ways. It's still kind of set in the 90s. Their problem-solving skills are based on what has other clinics done, and let's borrow off them. And borrowing from elsewhere has been great. And I think you called it lateral category analysis. That's it. Yeah. So that's been super helpful. And every time I find myself listening to you, I'm like, well, there's another idea to apply. So setting up this interview for our book club where we study a book every month and then releasing it as part of our podcast felt like a great opportunity to kind of go, our industry's a mess. Please apply your brilliant brain to some of the common challenges that we face. And I can give you one to get us kind of started in this conversation.
Go on.
So one of the biggest misconceptions that happens in our industry is many people believe the solution to a hearing loss is simply a hearing aid. They think it's the product. In truth, it's the service, it's the care, it's everything that goes into ensuring that thing performs for you on an ongoing basis because hearing loss is probably a thing that's going to happen for the rest of your life and it's not a one-stop fix. So there is this big issue right now between product and service. And what's happened very recently is Biden administration have signed an over-the-counter act, which means now you can go in a pharmacy and get a widget for your ear that just makes things louder. And there's a lot of confusion because the product is still...
I'm both pleased and upset about that. And the reason I'm pleased is that there will be a number of people who will never actually fix an appointment, but will... put it this way, okay? One of the mistakes that I think is made in healthcare in general is the presumption that everything starts with an appointment. Okay, now, just for a little bit of lateral category analysis, very, very few, probably fewer than 0.01% of the world's retailers operate on an appointment basis. Okay, because they accept the fact that an awful lot of trade is what you might call spur of the moment, spontaneous. And actually, one of the things they ought to be doing with flu jabs is saying, okay, let's just set up a sodding great caravan and say, want a flu jab, you can get one right now, and you will literally end up flu jabbing, an extra 100% of appropriate people. because retailers aren't idiots. They don't say, well, phone us up and we can make an appointment for you to come round our shop. Very, very exclusive and weird kind of couture probably does that. High-end, super high-end luxury goods probably do that. Okay, if you want to buy a yacht, you're probably going to have to fix an appointment. But the great thing about being able to sell hearing aids over the counter is that a lot of people will actually discover that this makes a significant difference and become converts. The downside is that there is a general tendency in everything to minimize labor costs as, if you like, the justification for digitization of anything is that, and best of all, we don't need any human beings. And now, okay, just to give an extreme example from the 1950s, my father in the late 50s, he's 90-something now, bought a vacuum cleaner from a shop in Abergavenny. And when he got home to Crickhowell, which is a few miles away from Abergavenny, there was a strange man waiting outside the house who had been sent by the vacuum cleaner company to basically show him how to use his vacuum cleaner, okay? Now, that's partly from an age, or at least it's the hangover from an age when labour was cheap and consumer electronics were insanely expensive, okay? I mean, I don't think it was necessary, to be honest. My father knew perfectly well how to operate a vacuum cleaner. But, I mean, think how bizarre that is, okay? I mean, you'd be completely... You'd assume some massive scam if that happened to you now. But actually, we have undoubtedly, particularly for elderly or disabled customers, we've over-egged the dehumanization of services. And what quite often happens, by the way... And this is the thing, this is why I said it's both good news and bad news. It's good news because, to be honest, people like me, we'll be pissed at an airport and we'll buy a hearing aid and we'll go, shit, this is really good. And suddenly we're now in market for this product, okay? That's a slightly frivolous, but you get my point. There are an awful lot of things we've bought, which we bought because of the circumstances we found ourselves in. I've bought a shirt, I might as well buy a new tie, and so, in some ways, I'm glad because essentially demanding an appointment for something sets the bar of self-identified problem very, very high. I think that's true of COVID vaccines. I think it's true of, I think it's also true of flu vaccines. You should have a mixture of pull and push, okay? And retail distribution just makes a huge difference to sales. End of, okay? The reason I get upset about it is that often these improvements start by being an alternative, a bit like New Coke. People didn't mind New Coke because they didn't know it was going to replace classic Coke when they trialled it. And they thought, well, more choice. If I don't like it, I can go back to the old thing. Oh, this is wonderful, okay? What then ends up happening, okay, unfortunately, is that the digital doesn't complement the analog, it ends up cannibalizing it and replacing it. So that, okay, it probably didn't make sense, okay, to have a chap at Sevenoaks Station car park taking my money every morning, and undoubtedly the app is a huge improvement. What will happen is the machines will disappear. Now, to be honest, personally, I don't give a damn. I'm pretty adept at parking apps. However, I'm conscious of the fact that if you're unfamiliar to Sevenoaks and you haven't used the slightly obscure Sevenoaks parking app before, and you're 70 years old and it's raining, okay? To be honest, you're not in a brilliant position to pay and you'll end up getting a ticket. To give an example of this, self-check-in of luggage at airports, the automated, digital, low-friction, low-cost solution is a good alternative. It's an appalling imposition. And if you want proof of this, I once was at Dublin Airport and I saw a gentleman of about 70, I would guess, struggling with the interface for the labelling of your own luggage. And I wandered over to help and discovered that without naming him, he was a former winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics, okay? Now, if Nobel Prize winners are having trouble with your interface, okay, it's fairly likely that lots of other people will. And the extent also to which interfaces are designed by bloody, 22-year-olds with 20/20 vision on a sodding 4K monitor that's, the size of an aircraft hangar, right, doesn't help. I mean, I can't read which is my shampoo and which is my conditioner anymore. I can't read the instructions on ready meals anymore, you know, and I'm going to have to start keeping a magnifying glass in the kitchen or in the shower for these things. So the extent, what bothers me is these things are always sold in as a marvellous compliment to other forms of control or purchase or whatever, and when they end up replacing it entirely, and when actually the human expertise you probably need to get the most out of the equipment suddenly basically ends up disappearing and the skill base gets lost, now we have a real problem. And that's my point. It's the new Coke problem. It's that people think, good, as a complementary alternative, I'm pretty happy with this. And then what they don't realise is, in the medium term, it's rather like it's quite hard to buy a non-smartphone. But there must be a lot of people, my father, in his 90s, let's give him a break, right? Who doesn't want to be downloading apps, he just wants to be able to make a phone call if the car breaks down. And I think the extent to which this happens really worries me. So actually, yes, that's the right thing to do, provided you somehow maintain the fact that these two things are complementary. And what tends to happen is, in our present age, is that the low-cost alternative, not necessarily because of consumer pressure, actually, but almost because of economic logic, ends up destroying the higher cost, higher touch, higher service alternative.
Interesting. And I suppose going back to our previous conversation, this topic of normalising hearing loss, given that 80%, 90% of people who have a hearing loss won't do anything about it, this could be somewhat of a catalyst. I
think there's an awful lot to be said for people who are hearing impaired kind of coming out. And I use that kind of advisedly, which is that the extent to which I suppose I don't know what it's like to be bald. I'm 56, but I don't have any hair loss at all. I've greyed a bit. I'm assuming that I'm not very vain about things like wearing a hearing aid, but then when the time comes, I don't know, is the truth of the matter. There is an element to it which is if you could get one that helped me screen out, something equivalent to noise-cancelling headphones, in terms of party background noise, I'd be ecstatic. Because I go to parties now, and I just stand there, it's white noise. Yeah. And genuinely, my wife seems to cope. I think women, their hearing ages differently. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. It's definitely more of a man problem, who are typically more stubborn about taking any...
Men are more stubborn about taking action, but I suspect also that the male loss of high frequency might be different. I think there might be
I believe so. I'm not...
Because cocktail party deafness seems to be a kind of a bit of a bloke thing, and it happens around, I think, basically when you hit 50, you're going to experience this to some degree. And I literally find myself at social events where, everybody might as well be speaking Gujarati. I genuinely haven't got a clue what's going on.
Yeah, and I think if you look at a lot of hearing technology today, that's where they're leaning. Like better speech in sound is the real push on that.
I suppose there's some new tech as well, which is probably just voice recognition and textualization for people who are extremely deaf. That must be kind of, because Google Glass would be a kind of killer for that, wouldn't it? I always thought they got rid of Google Glass too soon. Because
it feels like it was just launching the wrong window almost.
Well, first of all, they gave it, you had the glass holes problem. But secondly, you have to accept it's a network product in that applications for it will take time to emerge, but also it will take time to become socially normalized. And to be honest, I would have bought Google Glass by now had they, and they do, funnily enough, they do still manufacture it, and it's used for warehousing applications.
Interesting.
So people in warehouses, it's basically, go to A6, collect box 5, go here, go that. Now, for me, it would be the principal thing would be just time and diary and scheduling and reminders. But then if you added enhancements on, like, for example, the ability to actually do voice recognition. So, the people I was speaking to came with subtitles. There are certain settings where I'd find that pretty damn useful, actually.
For sure. One thing that I've heard you speak about before that we've helped apply to a few clinics that we work with that I find insightful is around wait times. So a lot of successful private clinics right now, they can be 6 to 8 weeks before that first appointment, which causes a lot of friction. Even though a patient can wait 7 years before they actually go, okay, now I'm going to do something, they found out they've got to wait 6 weeks, and all of a sudden they'll bounce somewhere else and they'll buy at Costco or something like that rather than wait.
Right. I mean, this is a really interesting thing, the psychology of waiting, which is you can, first of all, if you could find things for them to do, for example, a few trials or a few tests while they were waiting, then sunk cost would mean they'd tend to stick with the original path rather than deviating. I would argue that waiting, anything you can do to minimize waiting lists, like opening later, right, might be pretty good commercial practice. One of the things that does kind of make me a bit grumpy is small high street stores always complaining about the fact that they're being cannibalized by the big out-of-town retailers, and failing to counter the fact that it isn't really. The standard economic explanation is, they can buy cheaper than us, okay? The real reason is they just stay open later, okay? Independent tea shop closes at 4, Costa, it's going to be 6, maybe 5:30, maybe 7, okay? The difference that has, by the way, that massively increases the amount of traffic you get before 4 o'clock, staying open until 7. Because nobody likes being in a place where they're kind of eating on the clock, or when people are starting to kind of wipe down the cappuccino machine. One of the things that does baffle me about independent businesses is that they do need to kind of buck their ideas up about opening times. I mean, for God's sake, given the world of flexible work, just open at noon a couple of days, have a nice lie-in, right? Monday, do you need to be open at 9 o'clock at Monday? But in return, bearing in mind this is a male problem as well, okay? Open 1 or 2 evenings a week, and not necessarily, I'm not asking people to open on Sundays, that's giving up too much, but 1 or 2 late evenings a week, for God's sake, because there's a huge problem with GP surgeries, which is you have this system which is designed to minimize waiting lists, which is you call on the day for an appointment, okay? But there are 2 problems with that. A lot of people require 3, if you've got a job, okay, you need to give someone 3 or 4 days notice in many cases that you won't be in on Thursday morning. And so demanding appointments same day is massive, massive discrimination against people who have jobs, particularly the kind of job where you can't just fail to show because you had a doctor's appointment. They want a bit of notice so they can actually, work around your shift. And it seems to me that seems a really, really a crucial question, which is, I have to say about independent businesses that they could buck their idea. I get it, maybe you opened your tea shop because you've got childcare commitments. I get that, but I mean, if you can find just someone to keep the damn thing rolling for another couple of hours, the difference it'll make to your overall revenues is actually generally disproportionate. It isn't only the business you do when you're now open; it has a knock-on effect on the business you do when you were already open. It's a bit like the Oxford Tube. I don't know if you know that coach service from Oxford to London, but it runs 24 hours a day. And to be honest, the number of passengers on the thing at 3 o'clock in the morning doesn't warrant the journey. But a lot of people choose the Oxford Tube because they know if the worst comes to the worst, I'll be able to get back at 3 o'clock in the morning. And so it affects effectively who buys their tickets in mainstream hours, being open and being operating in weird hours. And I think that's a kind of element of complexity theory and behavioural science that needs to be more widely understood.
And I think that's interesting because if we look at this industry, one of the challenges they've got is we want the younger people in, the people who are still working, yet they close the doors at 4:30, and
you could say we have special. British Gas do this very well. If you have a boiler breakdown and you have their service care agreement, they have what they brilliantly call a parent appointment, which is most of their appointments like morning, afternoon, or whatever. But there's the mum's appointment, which is between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. It's your dad's appointment. I'm being sexist there. Do you notice that? God, bloody hell. But they call it basically a parent's appointment. And what you do is you call it, you name it kind of working people's appointments. So you kind of discourage pensioners from taking them, You know, you can use language to, you know, or you can just use your own discretion to say this person is obviously retired and I'm damned if I'm going to give them a 7 p.m. appointment. But on the other hand, somebody else you know, this is the weird thing about Sevenoaks. They complain about their high street being damaged, but then basically 20,000 people get off a train at around 6 o'clock every evening just in time to see their high street shut down. You know, it's not a brilliant way of doing things.
That's so true. Another interesting thing, if I look at this industry and if it comes down to behaviour, is how long people keep hearing aids. They buy them for several $1,000s, and then in that period, what typically happens is new technology launches every 1 to 2 years, and the industry really tries to get people to upgrade every 4 years. Yet what happens is it can stretch to 8 years, 9 years until they basically break. And I always wonder, is there anything that we're potentially missing apart from
There's a
offering the
particular
opportunity?
problem there, by the way, which is what I call the coach travel problem, which is I bought a new car for the first time in 11 years and was amazed to discover there are lots of amazing things that cars now do. Matrix headlamps being the most extraordinary, where they automatically dip, but they don't dip the whole half of the road. They just dip the bit where the oncoming windscreen is. Now, that's actually a pretty important, you know that business where late at night and it's raining and you've got oncoming traffic and you basically drive to the left of the oncoming traffic and go, I'm just doing this on faith. I can't really see where I am. And indeed, if the oncoming car decided just to swerve over 8 feet to the right, they'd more or less force you to drive into a ditch, I think. But, you know, those moments now, that, you know, the matrix headlamps are really, really significant safety improvement, adaptive cruise control, so on and so forth. You know, the tailgate that opens when you kick your foot underneath it. Those things are actually a pretty big deal. And the reason I call it the coach travel paradox is that most people my age, we last took a coach journey on National Express in kind of like 1991 or whatever, okay, when there were no toilets, there was no in-flight entertainment, no on-journey entertainment, and where actually the suspension and the whole kind of noise of the coach was pretty bad. And if you travel by coach now on a modern coach, it's chalk and cheese. I mean, you know, you've got pretty good onboard facilities, toilets, etc., etc. I had a journey where from Bristol the coach went from Bristol to King's Lynn in Norfolk. And I wanted to pee around about halfway through the journey. And the first piss break was Cambridge, which is where I was getting off anyway, okay? I mean, that's a long time to go without a pee, right? And so I think there is that question, which is that people... camping equipment's weird like that. If you've ever got into camping equipment, you know, and you've had a sort of 20-year break because you lived in a city and didn't go camping or didn't have kids, you suddenly discover that, you know, there are tents that pop up instantaneously and so on. So getting people in mind of more regular upgrades in the way that, you know, their upgrades for their mobile phones are probably pretty gratuitous, aren't they? Slightly new bevel, you know. I'm being a bit unkind, but, you know, people will upgrade mobile phones and things, but actually getting people into the... presumably some of these devices, you can upgrade the firmware online. Can you as well? Not really.
So much.
Now, interesting question. Why haven't hi-fi brands got into this market? The Sennheisers and the Bowers and Wilkins.
Yeah, it's happening with this over-the-counter.
It is starting to happen.
Sony have launched one, Jabra have launched one. There's a lot of talk right now. Since it was very fresh, this have just hit the shelves in the last couple of weeks as we're recording this.
It interests me because it's obviously a high-margin business, but also there's an element of reframing here, which is you're not correcting for a disability, you're augmenting yourself. Now, those of us my age, neither of you will remember the $6 million man who had bionic hearing. He had some sort of implant.
No, sorry.
Okay, never mind. Okay, this is a pointless conversation, but there'll be a whole bunch of people my age listening to this podcast going, oh, of course, he was called Lee Majors, wasn't he? Anyway, but we can rebuild him, etc. Oh, sorry. A brief nostalgic exploration there. But actually, you know, if you frame it as personal augmentation, you know, in other words, you know, there are all manner of ways you could sell these products, which is, I mean, okay, the ability to concentrate is one of them in open plan offices, for instance. I mean, you could argue that earbuds are effectively used, as a form of virtual partition. Undoubtedly, the noise cancelling aspect, the background noise cancelling aspect, is really, really interesting. And then why wouldn't you use the same things? Why wouldn't you make them look like AirPods? I mean, that might be a bit weird at a party, and actually enable people to listen to music through them.
Yeah, and it's pretty much on point of where we're at right now.
Because we've medicalised this whole category in a way.
Yes.
And actually, it's actually a bit more interesting than that, because you are undoubtedly in the audio category. And what might then happen is that if you make people see it as an augmentation rather than as a solution to a problem. Same would apply, a very interesting thing would probably apply with things like CPAP machines. I guess people, the improvements must have been absolutely enormous, and the miniaturization must have been really impressive. But most people are using the machines they bought, and probably I'll explain why. It's because we frame grudge purchases, okay, in a slightly different way to the way we frame pleasurable purchases. And so it's that fundamental difference between, if you've got someone who doesn't like consumer electronics, different with me. For me, replacing a dishwasher is quite exciting because it will come with weird new features like auto dosing and the ability to connect your dishwasher to the internet, which I do have, which is almost spectacularly pointless, I might add. But it's quite nice actually to see your electricity usage and your water usage in defence on the app. Okay. What tends to happen is certain people particularly resent spending money on things which are kind of infrequent purchases driven by necessity, as distinct from things which have an element of fun. And so there may just be a strong component of that. If you think about it in a way, part of the great problem, one place where Dyson failed, okay, was the washing machine. And the problem you had with the Dyson washing machine really was that no one, you can always have an extra Hoover. No one wants to replace their washing machine until the old one breaks. Brilliant product. But part of the problem is that people basically have, unless they either move home or they decide, their bathroom is so old that it's positively embarrassing, people don't generally like replacing those things. There's this very strong heuristic of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And of course, people are increasingly having that with cars, where they run cars into the ground, kind of thing. You might buy a new or nearly new car and then keep it for 10 years because they're not really aware of the improvements that are being made in car technology. By the way, it's not a totally irrational, we ought to remember this, okay, it's not a totally irrational thing to do, because if you buy a car 1 year old and keep it for 10 years, the last 5 years you have very low depreciation, really. So there isn't a second-hand market for these things, or is there?
No, not really.
Should there be?
Potentially. One thing that we identified quite early on was one of the reasons that people didn't like upgrading was because, what do I do with these things? And the general advice of the industry is, just keep them in a drawer as a backup. But it's a bit like telling somebody
the alternative is the trade-in. Yeah.
The trade-in, yeah.
The alternative is the trade-in, which is a different thing psychologically to a discount. In some respects, it's indistinguishable. But actually, the trade-in removes the sense of... Samsung do it fairly heavily when, for example, you can trade in a Galaxy S21 Ultra for a flip phone for a pretty generous amount. And what they realise, essentially, is that it de-guilts the purchase. That's the truth of the matter, I think.
Yep.
This is a really interesting thing with car marketing, which is, okay, I always say to car manufacturers, bundle options together, like glass sunroof, adaptive cruise control, matrix headlights, da-da-da-da-da. So nobody knows what each of them individually costs. And the reason for that is, would I pay £1,000 for adaptive cruise control? Probably yes. Could I justify it to my wife? Probably not. Okay? And so and also it's that kind of guilt factor. Now, on the other hand, if you pay £2,000 for a bundle of benefits, then you don't make the same kind of cost-value comparisons that you do if you buy the things individually. And I think the trade-in thing is a clever thing. Also offers like buy one get the second pair free might be interesting. Do you also are there packages for couples?
It's uncommon.
It's uncommon. Well, is one party in the couple always in denial about their...
Well, what's interesting is because, let's say, the husband has a hearing loss and that's what they come for, it overshadows that the wife has probably got one as well, because you naturally look at the person who's got the bigger issue. So I'm sure it's way more common than most people realise, but that could be quite interesting. One thing that's helped on the trading, by the way, is trading with a purpose behind it. So what we've done with a lot of our members, if they align towards like a mission trip or something that way round, which means that somebody trading in their old hearing aids knows that they're going on to do something good for somebody that otherwise would not be able to achieve better.
That's a very nice idea indeed. I mean, obviously, there are laptop organisations. The Computers for Africa was a similar one, wasn't it? Which again sort of de-guilts the waste a bit. But it does strike me as a very, very interesting category, because we've done quite a lot of work as a behavioural science practice on the language that's used. Okay, and for example, for adult incontinence, the word incontinence is very, very kind of, it's very much a line in the sand. Okay. Now, actually, it's perfectly common, particularly among females, which is, and so if you reframe it as, for example, manageable bladder weakness, okay, it's a completely different thing to being incontinent. And what quite often happens, I think, is that, and I would make this a sort of wider observation, which is that if you travel by train and you're registered disabled, there is a whole load of protocols that kick in. You can call in advance, or in some cases not even call in advance. You will get a wheelchair ramp to meet you off the train, etc., etc., etc. Okay. What then falls between the cracks in that definition of disabled is people who don't want to think of themselves as disabled, or who are not technically disabled but are, what the Australians would call a bit crook. Okay. So my father is 94 now. He could, I am sure, get all the disabled badges that he wanted and park where the hell he wanted. I've tried to persuade him to investigate, and he's just not interested, partly actually because that generation will tend to say, no, that's not me, that's people who are really disabled. And so, there may be an element of kind of, I don't want to be seen to be overly ambitious in grabbing what my entitlement is. I want to leave it to people who are really in need. So there may be an element of that which is altruistic. But I do notice, if you look at modern train travel, okay, there are a whole load of aspects of modern train travel, which is if you fall slightly between the two stools of actually formally registered as disabled and completely young and fit, the problems of modern train travel, you may be of an age where you don't want to drive anymore. For example, at London Bridge Station, there are disabled lavatories on each platform if you have a key. If you do not have a key, it involves going down something like 250 feet of escalator, going through the ticket barriers, which means you have to actually ask someone if it's okay to go through the ticket barrier, walking about 100 yards, peeing, and then retracing your steps all the way back to the platform. Now, this is a ridiculous kind of bifurcation of things. And I think it's an interesting question, which is that what we often do is we draw a kind of very, very clear bar as to what's defined. And actually, there's nearly always, this is interesting in things like app design, it's interesting. Designing for disabled people actually benefits an audience, a far wider audience than the people you have in mind when you design. So BT famously brought out a big button telephone, okay, with enormous kind of inch-sized press buttons. And to their absolute bemusement, it was intended for people who were significantly sight-impaired, okay? To their complete bemusement, it became for a time their best-selling phone. And of course, what they realised is it was a bedside phone in particular, because anybody who wears spectacles or contact lenses is effectively blind if they need to use the phone when they're in bed. Okay, so similarly, disabled ramps are also valuable for people with wheeled luggage. And in a sense, someone with very heavy luggage is to some extent disabled. If you look at door handles, for example, door handles tend to be mandated now instead of doorknobs on most public buildings, because if you've lost the use of your hands through arthritis or you simply don't have any hands, you can easily use an elbow to open a door handle, but a doorknob basically means you're trapped. Now, it's worth noting that anyone carrying 2 mugs of tea has de facto lost the use of their hands. And so having handles rather than knobs generally brings wider benefits. If I think there was an app we redesigned for fat finger use, as it's called, which is often a style of app design for people who don't have the precision or perfect eyesight of someone who can press a sort of 1 centimetre button with total precision. Now, I think it turned out, I can't remember, was it a parking app? It was something like that. But the point is, when do people use parking apps? Actually, when they're walking away from their car. They don't stand by their car, they walk away. So anybody walking doesn't have the same precision of button pressing that someone standing still does. And so in general, designing things for people who are disabled has massive spillover benefits to a much wider audience than the one you had in mind when you started.
Interesting. Yeah, some key lessons there.
I mean, there are interesting questions, by the way, which I've been meaning to write a piece about this for ages. So I come into advertising in 1988. And for the next 4 years, really, if there were now bear in mind the internet hadn't come along at that point. Okay, well it had, but I mean there was no web. Okay, for the next 4 years, most of the conversation, and not unreasonably, was about the greying consumer, because first of all, one thing you can predict is the number of old people who are going to be around in 10 years' time, because young people generally age. Okay, it is, we're not making sort of fanciful predictions about the future here. We know with a reasonable degree of certainty what the demographic mix is going to be and where the wealth's going to be in society. And so there were huge numbers of conferences back in the sort of mid to late 80s about, the silver consumer, the greying consumer, how do we cater for people who are older. Perfectly, by the way, for marketers, I think perfectly valid and justifiable area of inquiry. If you look at boomers now, there's going to be a sort of multi-trillion transfer of wealth to kind of boomers as their parents' generation die and they inherit houses. Because the slightly cruel thing about inheritance is that houses don't get inherited by 25-year-olds, they get inherited by 65-year-olds who already own a bloody house, right? Now, given what we can reasonably predict is going to happen, the lack of attention we pay to marketing to older audiences is really shameful. Because, we know it's happening. It doesn't require spectacular, rather than debating about what makes Gen Z different, or being absolutely obsessed about the supposed monumental differences between people who are 23 and people who are 27. Where, to be honest, we're in the realm of speculation. And indeed, by the way, they'll probably become much more similar to older people as they become older themselves. Okay, there's a strong degree of cohort. There are changes. They drink much less. There are certain stark changes in different cohorts. They drink much less than effectively their parents' generation would have done at the same age, just as an example. But a lot of this is highly speculative. We know there's going to be an aging population. We know pretty much how to cater for them, and yet we do nothing. The amount of discussion about the people who have the money, and also, incidentally, people who, all right, are probably slightly harder to persuade, but are much more loyal customers once persuaded. Because older people generally, in terms of their consumption patterns, they're more habituated. It makes sense, okay? They've got, first of all, they have less to gain from experimentation because they have less future. So if you're 70, discovering a wild new holiday destination is less valuable than discovering that when you're 25, because you've only got, a finite number of years to profit from the discovery. But also, correspondingly, you have more experience to draw on. You know what you like, okay? And there's certain behaviours that young people have to engage in experimentally. It's a bit like the algorithmic process of what's called simulated annealing. You start off with a kind of high temperature where you try lots of things, and then you'll notice that everybody aged sort of 17 goes to the Reading Festival once. Have you noticed that? If you try and find someone who's been to the Reading Festival twice, it's actually a bit of a niche audience.
I did the Leeds Festival once.
You did the Leeds Festival once,
yeah,
okay.
And never again.
And then what happens is as you get older, you kind of know what you like. You know, I mean, I'm not sure whether I'd like a cruise or not. That's an experiment I'll have to make when I get to sort of, well, I suppose I'm 56 now. I can start experimenting with that kind of thing. I don't know. But most things, as far as my taste goes, I go, I'll enjoy eating there. I wouldn't enjoy eating that, you know. And as a result, of course, when you win a customer in that age group, okay, you have less future lifetime value if you're being really cynical, but you do generally get a very high degree of loyalty. And also, they're appreciative of, you know, these are people who will require a degree of personal service. You know, it seems fundamentally wrong to me that we don't discriminate. In many ways, I think, if you look at government, I would say we're too generous to the old financially, if I'm being really brutal about it. Not all of them, but quite a lot, you know, the triple lock, quite a lot of these people have quite a lot of money. They got the kind of pension which I could never get, you know, final salary pension, okay? They've enjoyed the whole kind of ride of the property price explosion. You know, I don't think we need to be unstintingly generous to all people of age financially, but environmentally, I think we treat them very badly. You know, the number of experiences which are basically designed for 25-year-olds, whether it's the type size, whether it's the, you know, the extent to which, you know, there's no bloody escalator at this end of Blackfriars Station, you know, and the extent to which, you know, my father probably couldn't take a journey. He couldn't really drive 100 miles, and it would be extremely difficult for him unaccompanied, I think, to take a train journey of 100 miles. Now, that shouldn't be that hard. You just need benches, you need toilets, you know. You know, provision of seating is an absolute disaster in the public space. Provision of public lavatories. I know that sounds stereotypical, but no, it isn't. I mean, I sit on a thing called the Sevenoaks Rail Travellers Association, where I probably drag the average age of the membership down by about 10 years, even being 56. And they asked, the first question they asked of the new rolling stock that basically is used on the slow trains from Sevenoaks to Charing Cross. About 3 of them, the first question was, are there toilets on board? No. And the answer was, well, in which case I can't really use them. Perfectly reasonable. You know, we're shabby at the provision of those kind of public, literally, conveniences, okay? And I think, you know, we've kind of obsessed over what we can do with economics, and actually we should be looking at legislation here.
Interesting. And I'm going to give you the final question because I'm conscious of time as well. But knowing that listeners to this are majority based in the US and Canada, and I know you're a frequent traveller to the US.
Yeah, and to Canada, I'm a big fan. I'm actually followed by Tim Hortons on Twitter, which practically makes me, it's like a gateway to Canadian citizenship. Yeah.
I'm intrigued. Where's the best hidden spot? Because I feel like I've done all the cliche places a Brit should do in the US.
Oh, my point being that for every really famous place, there's a second best one that nobody's ever heard of, which is nearly as good as the most famous one, and as a result is actually better because when you go there, it's not overcrowded. So this is the kind of Trieste versus Venice argument. Actually, there are a lot of places, I think in the US, I mean, I went, for example, to Western Pennsylvania. I drove from Toronto to DC, and on the way was able to go to Falling Water, which is a place called River Run in Western Pennsylvania. What we didn't expect, we expected Falling Water to be magnificent as a building, and it was sensational. What we didn't expect was that Western Pennsylvania was pretty gorgeous. You know, we were joking about, effectively, Tuscany, the poor man's Western Pennsylvania. But it's incredibly wooded, it's spectacularly lovely. There are very, very large parts of the US which are unbelievably beautiful, which just don't, for whatever reason, don't break through in terms of fame. Because the trouble about fame in terms of tourist destinations, it's a bit like the Loch Ness effect, okay, which is that fame tends to be a winner-takes-all game. The most famous thing just becomes more and more and absurdly famous. And as a result, the third best is actually undeservedly little known in many cases. I mean, an example might be, you've got to go to the Grand Canyon, okay, because it's amazing. But there's a place nearby called the Canyon de Chelly, which is probably prettier in many respects. And actually, there are always these kind of places you discover by accident. I think for Brits, okay, now this is not relevant to your audience, I think, the first city you should go to in the States is actually Chicago, not New York. Because in a way, I suppose, you're European. New York, San Francisco, Boston are kind of European cities, whereas Chicago is like the capital of the US. And actually the contrast is more interesting and more amazing between, in a way, London and Chicago, which is also architecturally vastly superior to New York. I'm going to get some real grief here. But Chicago, in terms of the modern architecture, is inordinately better than New York. And in many ways, it's also an extraordinary insight into a city which is both very big, a world-class city, which is very, very livable in many respects. Obviously, don't go in February. But, and I discovered places. This is why I kind of hate air travel in a way, because you lose the serendipitous discovery of places en route. We discovered, actually it is quite famous, but we discovered Santa Fe, not knowing anything about it because we were driving between two places, and were completely captivated by New Mexico, which we more or less happened on by accident. White Sands we happened on by accident, more or less. And when driving, by the way, from Buffalo to Toronto, we stayed a night in a place called Niagara-on-the-Lake, and discovered it's right in the middle of... Now, this is us being clueless Brits. There are a lot of Canadians going, geez, do these people know nothing, okay? But I didn't know the scale of the vineyard area in southern Ontario, and Niagara-on-the-Lake is an absolutely idyllic place. I mean, what you don't realise as a Brit, by the way, is the Great Lakes are basically seas. And actually, you could have a seaside holiday on the Great Lakes. And actually, there are cruise ships that operate on the Great Lakes where you can kind of go from... Typical one might be, I don't know, you might go from Toronto to Chicago or Green Bay or somewhere, or whatever, Madison, Wisconsin. But it's one of those cases where in some ways, the second... In a way, okay, we're forced to go to Bondi Beach in Sydney because it's the most famous beach in Sydney. It's not all that great, okay? You have to go there to tick it off the bucket list. What I am saying is once you've ticked it off the bucket list, go somewhere else. Yeah. Go and find out what the number 2, what the number 3, what the number 4 is. Go and explore, because something, in many ways, I think, a large part of life skill now, it used to be that life was all about getting more money than the next guy. Right? In simple game theory, if you had more money than someone else, you had a better time. Okay? Now, I'm not denying that is still true to a degree, and that, money works that way. Actually, having flexibility of time and place has an enormous value in and of its own self. If one of the things I noticed, the real expense of having children isn't just the expense of the children, it's being forced to go on holiday in bloody August. I mean, think about it, okay, a villa that in Ibiza that would be £3,500 a week in August is probably £1,200 in early October. And actually, being honest, it's too fucking hot in August, right? You'd be better off going there in October for the purposes of having a good time. Yeah. And so if you can game the system, so the question you asked, and this is true of buying a house, for example, I'm not looking for the perfect house, I'm looking for the house that is most undervalued by people unlike me. Okay, so I always say there are certain facets of a house I don't care about. I wouldn't really be that bothered about being overflown. I'm not bothered by noise. I certainly wouldn't mind being next to a pub. In fact, if it's a good pub, being next to a pub is a positive benefit, right? Okay, now a large number of people would write off a home if it's next to a pub. Now, I don't go to sleep before midnight. The likelihood that I'd be kept awake by the pub is probably confined to like one day a year. So therefore, it makes sense for me disproportionately to look for things that I don't care about that other people hate. And I bought very successfully in London, but I bought a flat in a 1960s block, which at the time was generally a sort of disparaged and sort of unfashionable school of architecture, but which I didn't mind at all. And so if you can cultivate slightly different tastes from everybody else, it's equivalent to a kind of 25% pay rise. You know, this is my great, without, I'll give a few Americans a bit of holiday tips. East Kent, okay, it's not as good as Cornwall, in terms of coastline. But on the other hand, for me, it's an hour's drive away or an hour and a half's drive away, not 5 hours drive away. And again, it's, the place that's famous for being best in a globalized world is going to have one characteristic, which is A, in many cases, what makes it famous may be slightly arbitrary, and B, it'll be hideously overcrowded. So the two things you've got to do is either go to the most famous place at a weird time of year, or at a conventional time of year, go somewhere which actually, the number 4 is nearly as good as the number 1, but it's 10% as well known.
Interesting.
Interestingly, Roger L. Martin suggests that one form of ethical consumerism simply consists, if you're indifferent between the top-selling electric car, which is probably a Tesla Model 3, okay, but you're not that bothered between the Tesla Model 3 and, let's say, the Volvo or the Polestar, okay, or the Kia, okay, Roger actually argues that because the market leader tends to enjoy disproportionate market share, you're actually practicing ethical consumerism if, when you are indifferent between the two, you make a conscious decision to buy the less famous of the two. Because you're actually maintaining kind of biodiversity and competition in a market. You're helping actually promote kind of fairer competition.
Interesting. I've got some travelling to do.
I've got to do.
Yeah, you've got to go. Well, thank you so much.
Useful.
It's so helpful. Every time I listen to you, I walk away with several things.
But one discussion I'd be really intrigued in is how you get people who aren't deaf to actually consider these devices as an enhancement, not as a compensatory mechanism. That would be a really, really interesting framing exercise.
For sure. Well, thank you.
Absolute
thank you
pleasure.
so much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Right, you better get off to taxis.
I better